Sunny Shell, and today we're going to be talking with Professor Lauren Turek about the Christian evangelical influence on government, human rights, and the effect on the Supreme Court. Welcome to Women Atheists UNLOAD on Skeptic Haven.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take sh**. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take sh**. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take sh**. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement.
Everything I do so instinctive and so passionate. Every word I move so descriptive like an adjective. I got a vendetta against people who patented being negative when you should be getting after it.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Women Atheists UNLOAD. I want to welcome Lauren Turek. Thank you, Lauren, for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to see you.
So for those that may have missed your last appearance with us, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm an associate professor of history at Trinity University, which is in San Antonio, Texas. And I'm a historian of modern U.S. history, of U.S. foreign policy, of human rights, religion, and politics. Kind of a little bit, what I like to say is I like to teach the history of all the things you're not supposed to talk about in mixed company at dinner. So I'm really interested in moments in U.S. history where domestic politics intersect with foreign policy. So I've written a lot about religion and human rights policy in the 1970s through the 1990s. I'm interested in the way that religious groups have acted as non-state actors and have influenced our policy and the policy impacts in other countries. So, yeah.
Excellent. Well, you have quite an extensive both educational, professional history. So we're just really glad that you chose us to come on and talk with us. This is such an important topic. We were talking behind the scenes about some of the things that we wanted to discuss in this show. And so I think one of the first things we should probably do is define what evangelical is.
Yes, that is always really helpful. And when I was writing my first book, that was the question everybody asked. How are you defining evangelical? How are you defining it? Because the reality is there's a lot of different ways to define these groups, and there's debate about it because they're not monolithic. There are all sorts of different types of evangelicals. There are very far right, very far left, everything in between. And so when I think about evangelicals, if I'm looking for the kind of core things that define them, they are Protestant Christians that have had some sort of conversion experience, a born again experience where they feel that they have developed this like relationship with Jesus that's very sort of special and personal to them. They believe that the Bible is the authority for them. They don't not all believe that it's inerrant or completely 100% true, but they certainly take it as their core starting point, that is the authority. And then they're committed to evangelizing, to going out and spreading the word. And just, I find that definition very helpful. It's not one that I came up with. It's a definition that a sociologist of religion named Mark Shibley came up with. It's my favorite one because it's really simple and focused on both belief and the action that comes from that belief. And I think we want to pay attention to both belief and practice when defining these groups.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Now, I am curious, are American evangelicals unique, or is that definition pretty much global?
So the interesting thing about the spread of evangelicalism throughout the world is that in various parts of the world, as U.S. evangelicals or European evangelicals, say, went to countries in Africa or to Asia to spread their faith, they often were bringing with them a particular interpretation that was Western or American, even if they denied it or couldn't see it. But it was apparent to folks on the ground in those countries that it had the flavor of the United States or a country in Europe. On the ground, though, as people in those other countries converted, they tended to bring in their own cultural practices to some extent or their own twist on it. But those core beliefs are pretty... So even though there might be, in some parts of the world, it might blend a little bit with folk religions. There might be aspects. They still accept the Bible as an authority. They still feel they've had a conversion experience. They still go out to evangelize. So there's they're not the same as evangelicals in the United States necessarily, but they are sharing core beliefs, and they do see themselves as part of this global community of believers.
Okay, great. So I think the important thing to do is to start with kind of a history to bring us to where we are, because we can't really understand what's happening in the U.S. right now unless we look at that historical perspective. So I wanted to look at the rise of the evangelical right in particular. And I found it quite interesting, the change from when Carter was elected to when Reagan was elected just 4 years later, and how that kind of impacted the shift that we've been seeing today.
Yeah. Carter is so interesting because he runs openly as a born-again Christian. He's of this moment of the 1960s when we're starting to see in Newsweek and Time magazine that it's the year of the evangelicals, it's the year of born-again Christians, and there's this groundswell of people in the country saying that they've had a born-again experience and they're identifying in this way. But this gets to some of the ideas that there's actually not a monolithic political perspective at this point. Nixon, for example, if we can go back a little further, Nixon actually, if you go back and look at the documents, he was courting different religious groups in the 1970s, and he targeted some evangelical groups, but he didn't see them in the late 60s or early 1970s as a reliable Republican voting bloc, because they weren't at that point. There was a lot of different political perspective. In the 1970s, we do see evangelicals excited about Carter, partly because they think, oh, we've got a born-again Christian who's going to be in office. He would probably really advocate for persecuted Christians abroad. He'll probably stand for our moral beliefs. He's this Sunday school teacher. He's an outsider to politics. They put a lot of excitement and faith into him, but he's disappointing to them because he ends up doing a lot of his work to help religiously persecuted people abroad. All that work that he does is pretty quiet behind the scenes. He's not a big vocal guy about it, even though he's very vocal about other human rights issues in other types of regimes. So he's not going after the communists the way that they want. And he does not bring this push to target things like abortion or prayer in school that the religious, the folks who are evangelicals on the right are starting to get really interested in. So, that is not something that they had been as active with in, say, the 50s and 60s. That's Catholic groups were often the most active on anti-abortion issues earlier at mid-century. But with this sense that there might be attacks on prayer in school, there might be efforts to take away the tax breaks that evangelical schools that discriminated based on race were enjoying. Like, all of that started to create a sense of victimization among some of these groups, and they start to move to the right. They start to look for someone other than Carter. They get pretty disappointed with him, and they see in Reagan this strong sort of standard bearer for their beliefs. Even though Reagan is not an evangelical, he really is able to speak to them. One of the things that he says at one of his, as he's running, he says, you may not endorse me, but I endorse you. And he's speaking to evangelicals and sort of suggesting to them that he is going to stand up for their beliefs and he's going to stand up for their objectives. And they really think that maybe this will be the guy who's going to both, stand up to communism and maybe roll back abortion rights and all those things. And he also does not do that. He stands up, I guess, against communism in some ways, but he disappoints them on abortion and some of their other key issues. But he speaks their language.
Right. And that's when, during that time, is when Jerry Falwell kind of starts making his rise. And he actually infiltrated government in some very key ways with this moral majority platform. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, the moral majority, which starts to gain influence in the late 1970s, 79, also in organizations like Focus on the Family. There are a number of these groups that start to emerge in this period, and they are incredibly politically powerful, partly because they are able to marshal the use of like telephone lists and mailing lists to really blanket their supporters, so they can identify who is a likely candidate to vote for people that they want to see elected on the right, and they can just send out all sorts of advertisements to them, really targeted political advertising. And one of the things that groups like this start to do is they will send out these report cards on different members of Congress who is voting the way that we want, to vote. And so they'll list, abortion rights, prayer in school, gun rights, all of these things that become their hot button issues. And they're able to start to really rally and lobby their potential followers. And it's very effective. And then, of course, people like Bow Wow are also connected to the rise of televangelists. So they're connected to folks like Pat Robertson, and they're able to be in people's homes on TV, again, talking about not just religious issues, but also political issues and foreign policy issues of the day. And so they build this very large network across the country where they're kind of, putting out a certain perspective about what voters should be paying attention to. And it's very effective politically. And they encourage their viewers, the people who are getting these mailings, to write to their members of Congress, to write to their local state representatives, just to be really active, to go to rallies. And that grassroots activism is also influential on members of Congress. It starts to get people elected. So Falwell is, he's really advocating for that. He's engaged with that with his, radio shows and whatnot. And he's also, he's going on mainstream TV shows to talk about issues related to politics and to foreign policy. And so he's building a national reputation for himself.
What I find quite interesting is that we have laws in this country, tax laws, that basically say you can't do that and still be tax exempt. And yet they were doing this on such a wide scale. It almost seems like there was no way to really keep them accountable, because it was just so big so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it really is this remarkable transformation that happens in this period, and it's it is coinciding with some of the broad ideology of the Reagan era, where Reagan is saying we want to pull government out of involvement. We want to reduce taxes. And of course, he's saying this as he's also increasing spending dramatically, right? So he's saying, oh, no more of this excessive spending. We're going to cut taxes and do all this stuff and reduce regulation. And then, of course, he's doing the opposite. He is actually expanding spending. But he's saying those words. And so the ideology emanating from the White House is one of let's get out of the way. Let's get government out of the way. Even though from the perspective of, the Constitution, the idea should be that the government should not be establishing a church. It should not be providing a preference to one church over another. And that in turn, churches should not be really involved with this kind of political activism, and yet many were. And there are a lot of questions that would come up about that activism. I think we're still having those discussions now, even more so perhaps, because some churches now are so obviously acting as political organization groups as opposed to just churches.
Right. And I think there's also been some good things with that. The civil rights movement was very much through the Black churches. And so, there's the positive, and now we're seeing the negative from that same type of activism.
And, Reverend Barber now with the Moral Monday movement, that there's, again, the religious left saying, hey, we shouldn't let the religious right have all of the activism. Like, these churches are a way to organize on social justice issues. They were in the 50s and 60s, and they still are. So it's a battle. I mean, I think it's an open question then about where does the state, where does the state step in? I mean, that's a debate for constitutional scholars.
Yes, absolutely. So we've seen the move from Carter to Reagan, and then with Reagan, the rise of the moral majority, particularly white evangelical movement with Jerry Falwell, and picking up that anti-abortion and also the anti-homosexual, movement. And then we've seen quite a major shift, though, from Reagan to Trump.
Yes.
And one thing we were talking about behind the scenes was the American Christians' identification with Christians around the world, the persecution of Christians around the world, and that persecution complex, for lack of a better term, kind of rising up. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. What I find, one of the things that I have really been interested in investigating is the way that during the Cold War, so thinking about especially the 50s and 60s, people in the United States are very cognizant of persecution happening, particularly against religious groups, but also against other dissidents in Soviet countries. So the Soviet Union, but also countries in the Eastern Bloc, in China, and elsewhere, that there's this concern that these, quote, atheistic communist countries are inherently anti-religious, and there is indeed religious persecution happening in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. So they are getting information about absolutely atrocious abuses from co-believers. Everything from children being, not allowed to be taught their faith by their families, so not even allowed in private to be taught, people being put into forced psychiatric treatments, people being beaten, arrested, sent to prison camps, having their churches bulldozed. I mean, just on and on. Absolutely awful persecution, right? So very much happening. So there's a real concern about that, not just in white evangelical churches, but among churches in general. Jewish groups very concerned about the persecution that Jews faced in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. So there is a broad concern about that. That motivates a lot of evangelicals and other groups to advocate for their co-religionists. So they are going to lobby Congress on this issue. And that's one of the reasons, again, that they're disillusioned with Carter. They want more activity to get preachers who've been arrested in jail to be released. They are really active on that. And so when Reagan comes into office and he says he's going to specifically champion the cause of religious liberty abroad, they are really excited about that. And so it becomes a key aspect of their understanding of what the U.S. should be doing in terms of human rights. That the goal of U.S. human rights policy for conservative Christians is to promote religious liberty, because from their perspective, if you don't have the freedom of conscience, the freedom to practice your faith, then you have no other rights can really follow. You have to have that first. And so that is their core interest. They're less interested in the other human rights that secular human rights organizations are fighting for, but they're focused on that. And so that becomes a driving force for their activism throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And this becomes, I think, really key, because as they are going out, they're engaging with information about persecution in these countries, persecution that they read about in majority Muslim countries, etc. They start to identify themselves, I think, because they understand themselves to be part of a global Christian movement. They start to identify themselves with these persecuted Christians. And then with the cultural changes that are happening in the United States itself, the passage of Roe v. Wade, what they see as attacks on prayer in school, the trend towards secularization, the kind of moral panics that they have over sex and rock and roll and all of these cultural changes in the United States start to seem to them to be evidence that they are themselves under threat at home. And so there's this victimization, this perception that they are victims, even though, of course, they remain in the majority position, they have dominant power, but they see themselves and they identify themselves as victims of persecution at home, which I think is why you get this, every time the winter holidays come around, people get all bent out of shape when somebody wishes them happy holidays, as though they've, it's like, this is not persecution, friends.
Right, exactly.
The inclusion of others is not your persecution, but that's their that's their perceptions. They feel like this victim ideology that they have taken on. And I think we really start to see that come into play, with Donald Trump, but even earlier. There's, back in 1993, the U.S. adopts a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and initially it's intended to really try to protect people who are experiencing persecution. There are groups in the United States that are experiencing persecution. It's just that evangelicals aren't one of those groups. But by 2014, we're starting to see shifts within the Supreme Court where they're using the tenets of some of these ideas that they need to do more to protect religious freedom, but they're actually using it to discriminate against others. So the Hobby Lobby case is a really good example. The cases where we look at Catholic hospitals that are seeking to not have to comply with all of the requirements of the ACA. The case over the cakes, baking cakes for LGBTQ people. I mean, all of these cases, we're starting to see a language of religious freedom come in, used to actually discriminate against others. And so there's this shift. And Trump really takes this on. He, said a lot during his time in office about how, Christians were so persecuted. Again, here's somebody who, much like Reagan, not an evangelical, not even really, not really anything. But he sees the benefit of using them politically, and he speaks that language. And I think he made a lot about that sense of victimization that these groups have. And the court, especially as it has grown much more conservative, has continued to rule in a way that privileges the rights of specific religious groups over others, while suggesting that they are not actually imposing an undue burden or whatever, et cetera, et cetera. So they're claiming that they're supporting religious freedom, but in actuality, many of these rulings are privileging Christian churches, particularly conservative Christian churches.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking about we have that case in Maine where the coach is able to lead their students in prayer, the teammates in prayer, and you think about his right to be to be a Christian, to pray, versus the rights of the students who don't have the right to say no to someone in power over them, their coach. And that's a big power right there, is when you're on a team and your coach is doing this and being ostracized by others.
I think that's one of the real issues that the court is not taking seriously, is the way that power works and the level of coercion that is involved. And so the reality is that, those teenagers, maybe the coach has not said, you have to do this or I'll kick you off the team, but he doesn't need to, because he's in a position of power and he decides who gets to play. He has a power over them where they are coerced into engaging. And the court, the justices, the conservative justices, are not paying careful attention to that. But that's the case. That was the case in Florida. There was a case in Maine about, in areas that didn't have, access to schools, could the state fund, or would the state have to be forced to fund religious schools? And again, the court ruled that if the state was denying those funds, it was abrogating religious freedom. But of course, it looks like the state then is supporting these religious schools. It seems to be a challenge to our protection against an established church and the separation of church and state. But we have a Supreme Court that seems very eager to jettison a lot of those interpretations in favor of a very, very different perspective.
Well, and, it's not just the Supreme Court. I don't think people, or many people, those of us who are paying attention probably do know this, but probably the average person doesn't recognize that Trump had hundreds of judges.
Yes.
All the way from state, state and federal judges that are the ones who are making some of the first rulings that then take it to the Supreme Court, that is now very far right.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of these states have put in their own restoration of, religious freedom restoration acts. So, Mike Pence introduced a very stringent one in Indiana before he became vice president. And so these rules, these state level rules, are often much more conservative in focus. And these are the things that then get tested in state level courts and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so, it's the number of judges appointed matter. Absolutely. And these state level laws, I think we sometimes forget how important those local and state elections are, and the decisions about who gets appointed to different positions on the, in the judicial branch. Yeah.
Right. And I think I keep going to the past, but it really helps to kind of figure out how we got where we are now. Because everything that I'm thinking of, the things that we've been talking about, the Freedom Restoration Act, the Hobby Lobby cases, all of that, they go back to that persecution feeling of that American Christians identified with. And I think it's also interesting that it seems to have started in the USSR, that Russian, the way that they were persecuted, Christians were persecuted, and other religious people were persecuted in Russia at that time, and how fighting for that and then getting backlash from that helped to lead to the growth of that persecution complex. And now today we have these pro-Russian evangelicals, and how all of that kind of happens. It seems like all of this is just really tied together in this really weird web
Yes.
that goes all the way back and is kind of happening now, if that makes sense.
Yes. Well, and I mean, just to think about what happens with the fall of the Soviet Union. So Mikhail Gorbachev passed away last week.
Mm-hmm.
He is a very interesting person for us to talk about in this context, because at the same time that Ronald Reagan is in the United States, like really rattling the sabers about how he's going to roll back communism and all this, and how the Soviet Union is this evil empire. By 1985, the Soviet Union, after several very shortly lived leaders, there was a series of these very elderly, like hardline Soviet leaders who were quite elderly, and they basically each are in office for like a year and then they die. So it's a kind of a moribund leadership. But then we get this relatively young, kind of vibrant leader in the sort of form of Mikhail Gorbachev. He comes in. He is very, very aware that his society is in decline, that the Soviet economy was in terrible shape. There's a huge dissident movement that is pushing for greater human rights, and he knows that that's also undermining Soviet power on the world stage. It makes them look bad. He's cognizant of that. And he is a true believer in communism and Soviet communism, and so he wants to make changes to save the system. And he puts in place some of these changes through glasnost and perestroika, so just general, more sort of economic flexibility, greater openness, that sort of thing. And it sets in motion changes to his society, including some of the revolutions, the Velvet Revolutions that happened in Eastern Europe, where these political dissidents who have been facing persecution either for religious or political reasons rise up. They call for the end to their regimes, and they topple communist governments. But those changes also are starting to happen in the Soviet Union, propelled in many ways by some of the changes that Gorbachev puts in place. And despite the protests of hardliners, including hardliners in the KGB, like Putin. So there is, and these changes do eventually lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. They certainly contribute to the collapse or the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. What's interesting is two things that I would love to sort of talk about here. Gorbachev also oversees an opening to some religious groups. So in addition to being ready to celebrate the 1,000-year history of Christianity in Russia and the Orthodox Church, he also, as the Soviet Union is collapsing, so in the 80s, he's making things less bad for Christians. There's efforts to reduce persecution. As the Soviet Union is collapsing in the early 1990s, he starts inviting evangelical groups from the United States to come to talk about civil society in Russia. He's worried about the moral belief, the sort of morality and morale of the Soviet people, and he thinks that some of these religious groups that have been sending efforts to evangelize, that they might be people who can give the people lessons, and ultimately there's this moment of openness to all these different religious groups, and when the Soviet Union collapses, they rush into to Russia and to the other states that broke off. They go to evangelize. It's not just evangelicals. It's like Hare Krishnas. It's LDS church people. It's everybody. They go in, they're like, oh, this is our moment. Well, the Russian Orthodox Church, suddenly ascendant, very unhappy about this. And so the window will close. There will be new restrictions placed on what foreign religious groups can do and whatnot. But there is this moment of openness that's very interesting. So that's on one side. The other side is that, as I mentioned, a lot of the former like Politburo members, people in the KGB who were really hardline communists, or people who really believed strongly in the Russian Empire, they are furious at Gorbachev. Furious. Like, there's a reason that Putin is not going to go to Gorbachev's funeral. It's because they blame Gorbachev and the changes that he made for the decline of the Russian Empire. And so when somebody like Putin then came into power, he is somebody who's advocating not for a return to communism, obviously, but he is somebody who wants this very strong position for himself, and he wants to restore what he believes to be a larger Russian empire. And that, I think, clearly explains some of the invasions into places like Chechnya, Ukraine right now, this war. Like, he has a vision for a larger Russia, but he's also culturally conservative. And so for evangelicals in the United States, some of the identification is because he is virulently anti-LGBTQ. He's virulently opposed to the kind of culture changes that we're seeing in the United States, and he still describes the United States in some ways as a decadent Western culture. Viktor Orban in Hungary, who religious conservatives and the Republican Party invited to come. I mean, he was at speaking at CPAC and whatever. He's another person who really seems morally aligned with these evangelical Christians, again, speaking to these Christian values that conservative Christian values that they embrace. So I think these things are connected, again, from the 80s, that story of what's happening in Russia in the 80s helps us understand what happens with the rise of Putin and Putinism. And the connections between evangelicals are also related to those culture changes that are happening, not just in the United States, but globally, and the resistance to them. And this also pertains to human rights. Again, like, the LGBTQ movement is a human rights movement, and it's a global one. And people like Orban and Putin are reacting against it.
Right. And that's how suddenly there is this love of Putin's Russia from our evangelicals, because they can identify with that kind of agenda, the conservative agenda.
Exactly. We've got, first of all, this, conservative leader, really emphasizing the kind of culture war issues that we care about.
Right.
And putting down people who, really cracking down on people who disagree.
Yeah, absolutely. So just so if you are just now joining us, this is Women Atheists Unload, and we are talking with Professor Lauren Turek about the rise of evangelicals and the influence in American government, and some of our social policies, and then our Supreme Court. For those of you that have been in the audience, please, thank you so much for watching. I want to say hello to some of these people. I'll just go really quickly down the list if I can. We have Ryan Cultastic, Escalon. We have Kat the Humanist. We also have Jenna. Hey, Jenna. Doorknob Head. Let's see. Farron Salas. Hey. Kira J, and many, many others. I know I'm missing some. I also want to say thank you to those who are helping behind the scenes, such as Courageous, who is adding so much to the chat. Just really appreciate that. If you have questions for Lauren, please get those in, and we will make sure and highlight those and ask her, because we want you to have the chance to ask those questions. Okay, so getting back to our discussion, if we talk about how kind of the history of how the evangelical movement has come along, we've looked at the change from Carter going all the way to Trump. We've talked about some of the things that Trump did, such as aligning with Putin's Russia and Putin himself, which while I didn't understand it until you start thinking about these things, it really does make sense why that has been a positive a positive stance for the evangelical right and that conservative movement. But there's also been things like he moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. Why was that a popular thing? I didn't really understand that.
Yeah, so that popular and very controversial, right? So that is something. So evangelicals, and there are people who are more expert on this, but because evangelicals have a range of beliefs about the end times, some evangelicals embrace the idea that one of the things that they'll need to do is that they will have to have there will come a time when all the Jewish people go back to Israel, and the end times will happen, and then all of the evangelicals will be spirited up. Well, all the Christians will be spirited up to heaven, and then we'll have 1,000-year reign. Well, there will be Armageddon, and then 1,000 years of peace. I mean, it varies. It depends on their beliefs about eschatology, but the getting back to Israel is a key thing, and so they have become a very close allies with conservatives in Israel. And so they have advocated, to move the embassy to, it's just part of their sort of broad sort of connection with Zion, with, again, conservative Israeli goals. So they've made common cause. To be clear, there are a variety of perspectives within Israel about that move, but Christian conservatives are. Many of them are Christian Zionists. They have a particular view of what the U.S. relationship with Israel should be. And so they become strong advocates for Israel against its neighbors, for opposition to the deal with Iran. I mean, there's a bunch of foreign policy issues that come up with that. I'm not a super strong expert on U.S. Middle Eastern relations. Much more of my work is on U.S. Africa, U.S. Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and the U.S. and Latin America. But there is some really interesting work about that. But it was very controversial. The other thing that happens during the Trump years is that we have Mike Pompeo and others actually really strongly asserting that the U.S. should be promoting a particular version of religious freedom globally, that should be a key thing that it's emphasizing, along with essentially capitalism, like private property rights. And so we're seeing not just this emphasis on a particularly Christian Zionist policy toward Israel, which is one thing that Pompeo and other evangelicals embraced and pushed through the Trump administration, but also a sense that U.S. policy goals more broadly should be aligned with the Christian perspective of what human rights are. So redefining a U.S. human rights posture based on that very narrow view of what human rights are. And I think they go together because it's an effort to make manifest the evangelical foreign policy goals, which really are focused largely on global religious freedom and support for conservatives in Israel.
So when you say that really struck me, and I heard it on one of your other interviews that you had done. You just mentioned the very narrow view of human rights that they're advocating. And that, I think, it can be a little shocking or jarring for some of us to hear, because we don't think of the evangelical right as being strong human rights proponents. So what do you mean by their narrow view of human rights?
Yeah, so I contrast that with, so I guess I'll back up. The idea of human rights is one that has been in development for a very long time. We can look back to Enlightenment ideals about natural rights. We can look back further than that to the origins of different religions and their perspectives on the sensitivity of rights, wherever they come from. But, those rights are contested throughout time, right? And so even after 1945, when the UN starts to put together a statement on human rights, and we eventually get the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it's hard to actually enforce those rights. We have this wonderful big document that lists a lot of different rights: right to religious freedom, right to movement, right to an income, right to bodily autonomy. How do you enforce that? There's that question. And so it takes a while for the world community to figure out ways to enforce those rights. A lot of what ends up happening is not necessarily through the international justice system, because that's actually very hard to work through. but through the creation of norms. And so there's time. It takes time before some of these rights become accepted international norms where violators can be isolated through things like sanctions. And not every right enumerated in the UDHR is one that is being normed. In the U.S., initially, a lot of times in the 40s and 50s, the focus on human rights by human rights activists was on civil rights, because that was the clear violation of human rights in the United States, was the civil rights of people of color. By the 1970s, we're starting to see the emergence of a global human rights movement, one that is pushing for economic and social and civil rights in parts of the world that are living under terrible regimes, like places in Latin America where people are being brutally physically abused. Also dissident movements in the Soviet Union that are pushing for religious freedom and other things. And the movement's really powerful. You don't want to come out as a, say, senator or congressperson and say that you oppose human rights. That sounds very bad.
Mm-hmm.
But conservatives don't want to, well, they don't embrace the broad view of human rights that, say, Amnesty International does. They're not promoting rights to bodily autonomy. They're not promoting rights to economic justice. That is not their bailiwick. They do not buy that. They don't believe that those are rights that everyone should be entitled to. And so when I say they have a narrow perspective on rights, I mean there are certain rights that they care very much about. And the right to freedom of conscience is one of them. I think it's the primary one, followed by, I think, property rights and that sort of thing. So it's, when I say they have a narrow view, it is because it's so does not encompass the range of human rights that I think were envisioned in the UDHR or are envisioned now by human rights activists. And those rights have expanded from secular organizations. So they become really, evangelicals become key activists on the issue of international religious freedom. And those are important things to fight for in a general sense. My perspective is that they tend to fight for it because they want to be able to go and evangelize. So to me, it seems very self-serving. But in a broad sense, pushing to ensure that religious minorities do not face persecution, or people who don't practice religion, that they also should not be persecuted against, that is indeed a sort of key human right that is essential.
Right.
As I said, they have like a self-serving perspective on it. Does that get it? Why it's like very narrow?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So it's that freedom of conscience, which is basically freedom of religion, freedom to not just hold your religious views, but the freedom to evangelize. I mean, really, to evangelize those rights.
Yeah.
And that's a part of their practice. It's not just their daily practice within themselves, but an inherent part of their identity is with missionary work and bringing others the gospel.
Exactly. And so to them, if they can't evangelize, they are being denied a key piece of their religious practice, which is, again, what they wanted in the Soviet Union, what they weren't allowed to do.
Right. But it's also very interesting that they want to, at the same time, at least it appears to me, limit those same rights for other religions, because that is dangerous to them, just as in Russia, when the Orthodox Church cracked down because they saw their power. It's kind of the same thing, but on the evangelical side. Is that not right?
It varies. So what's interesting is we do see, and I'm not sure if it's because they're afraid to appear hypocritical. I often think they don't care about that, or they don't see it as, but it is interesting because there have been folks like Mike Pompeo and others who have been very concerned, for example, about persecution against the Uyghurs in China.
Mm-hmm.
I generally, when I look at the statements from political leaders, I tend to wonder, is there an ulterior motive to those statements that they're making? I think among like rank and file evangelicals, for those who are very concerned about persecution of the Uyghurs, it's probably a genuine concern about religious minorities. I do wonder for the conservative leadership why they're so worried. I don't see them as natural humanitarians concerned about the genuinely awful stuff that is happening. I am concerned
Right.
about them. So it seems to vary, and they are somewhat selective about which groups they highlight as being persecuted, and so it's an open question, I think, about
Right.
who they're really concerned about. They very much to me seem to be prioritizing Christians over others, though they don't exclusively talk about persecution of Christians now, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit, it depends.
Right. Yeah. And there's, I would say that there's probably pockets
Yeah.
here and there that are, I mean, I'm not just with evangelicals, but I'm thinking of like Jehovah's Witnesses that are very much, they're not, quote, not politically active, although there's some behind the scenes in the leadership, but this persecution issue and not wanting anything else to be to have that same right. They want their rights. They don't necessarily want others. Or you have pockets like the Southern Baptist Convention that is specifically trying to promote American Western evangelical proselytization and not allowing others. So there are pockets, but I guess it's important to note that just because, say, someone like me who lives in the Bible Belt Southern Mountain region that sees that's not the full evangelical picture. It's correct.
The thing I always say to everybody, I mean, this is the annoying thing that historians will always say is, well, it's all very complicated. They're just, I mean, human beings are messy, and sometimes they hold contradictory beliefs even within the same person. Mm-hmm. And so, it's one of the things I think we're seeing is a little bit of tribalism where people might identify in a tribal way with the evangelical or conservative perspective, and they might not even go to church or really know that much about the faith. But there's been this like, well, I'm a conservative, and so I'm part of this group. Mm-hmm. But even within there, it's just that there aren't monolithic beliefs. And I think the vote in Kansas recently about the abortion ban is an interesting one, because there was such a surprising, I think, turnout to vote against the ban that they had proposed. So clearly some people who ordinarily would vote with evangelicals or with their tribe did not.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly women.
Right.
And so it's a good example of like, it's complicated. It mm-hmm. isn't monolithic. And if you start to drill down and ask people and ask them to really push and think about their beliefs, they might not always toe the line of what the church leader or denominational leader might say.
Right, absolutely. Well, that kind of bringing that part about the vote in Kansas on the abortion ban, that brings us to the Supreme Court and how the last few justices were kind of pushed in, not going through the correct procedure, just as Obama's last one was not allowed to go in. That went against proper procedure, but regardless, now we have this Supreme Court that is skewed overwhelmingly to the right. Yes. And so, just to start this off, we have a question from the audience. I think kind of helps to bring this in. It's from John Hudson. Do you think an expansion of the Supreme Court could help reverse some of these decisions that have recently been passed? And if so, how? If not, why?
I think this is a good question. I mean, one of the issues is that an expanded Supreme Court could have the potential to do some of this, although it would require the legislature to propose some new laws that would then be tested. So one thing that Congress would need to do would be to pass a law at this point that would affirm rights to abortion and that sort of thing. And I think activists have been saying, hey, Roe v. Wade, that was the floor, that was the minimum, that we should be looking for something better, something that offers better protections for women and the autonomy over their bodies. And so an expanded Supreme Court, if Congress were able to pass, say, even potentially just sign off on the Women's Rights Amendment, like the Equal Rights Amendment, that has some potential. But barring that, which doesn't seem like it might happen for frustrating reasons, there would need to be some sort of laws passed and then tested. So it would have to come up before the Supreme Court again for us to move in that direction. And I'm not hopeful that we're going to get a court expansion, though I think we should. If we think about how many, there is no rule that says there have to be 9. I think one thing that we could think about would be expanding the number of the lower level courts to correspond with the growth in the population that we've had, that maybe to 13 districts and then 13 Supreme Court justices. That is a proposal that's been out there. So there are discussions about how to do that. I don't know that it's going to happen. Be nice.
Right. I just don't see the current makeup of our entire legislative body being able to, we can hardly pass anything without an executive order almost right now. We're just so clearly divided. I don't see those things happening. And I agree with you. Any legislation that's passed will be challenged and go to the Supreme Court. And so it's kind of, we're kind of stuck in a sense right now, I think.
Well, and the ERA, that is a technical issue, which is what makes that one so frustrating. It's like the 35 states have, anyway. Again, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but that is one where I'm like, oh, who knows? Right. But yeah, I'm with you. I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical that we're going to see a lot of movement there.
Right. Exactly. So what we've taken a look at all of these things, and we've seen them coming up even before Trump with things like the Freedom Restoration Act, which, like you said before, was a Democrat bill, but it's really been used by the right to kind of push some of these evangelical agendas. But we've seen the Hobby Lobby case, the cake case, and all of those type of things. What do you think is on the horizon that we need to be really looking at?
Before I came on, I was sort of thinking, I'm not sure which cases are coming up in 2023. So that would be something for the next round, would be to pay attention to cases that will test religious freedom in various ways. I think we're going to start to see, I suspect, with the with the removal of privacy rights, I think likely we should see, or we unfortunately will see challenges on contraceptives, potentially challenges on, they've said challenges on LGBTQ marriage, but right to privacy is also part of interracial marriage rights and privacy more generally. So I think we should pay attention to that. I suspect there will be more challenges on the kind of prayer in school. So, I'm guessing that that's what it's going to be. And some of that is an educated guess based on what Clarence Thomas said would be next.
Right.
So we'll see. But of course there have to be challenges that come up, right? It's the Supreme Court's not just going to, so it depends on what comes up through the lower courts that the court will then take under consideration. So we'll see. It is something to pay attention to.
But I kind of feel like what he did when he stated, well, this isn't it, we're also going to be looking at these other things, was kind of a rallying cry to first the base, and then the legislatures, because some of these things came about from legislation that's been passed. Well,
and then there's the question too of okay, is part of that to keep the base together, because the dog has caught the car. And there is in fact backlash to it. How do you keep the base angry and feeling victimized and feeling aggrieved? Because that's how they mobilize themselves.
Right.
And so that might be, the question is, are those issues going to have the same amount of power to move the base? That's an open question. I think it is easy for some of these groups to feel like they are out saving unborn babies. They don't have to do anything to care about what they see as an unborn baby. It might be different when we're talking about some of these other issues. They may not feel as vitriolic about them. We'll see. It's maybe a little different if you can't put up some absurd picture on a billboard or on a protest sign to protest like contraception or an IUD. I don't know.
Right. I think probably the this is just my guess. The anti-trans and looking at I've seen several of the evangelical legislators talking about this, that equating the trans movement with trans rights movement, the trans rights movement with kind of coupling it with child abuse,
Well,
and
that certainly happened here in Texas.
mm-hmm.
I mean, our governor, I mean, he he has, first of all, torn apart the Child Protective Services agency. I mean, a huge number of people quit because he was telling them to go after parents who were seeking care for their children as though they were child abusers. But the amount of vitriol that the existence of people who are trans is just, you may be right. That might be the other thing that can pull up the kind of vitriol that they need to keep their movement together.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just, again, clearly a key human rights issue, but they're very much on the, on the other side of human rights in this case. They're, living in this state, it's like these poor kids and young adults. I mean, some of the states are working to strip medical care from adults. Again, that stripping their right to privacy to take, the interventions that they need to care for themselves.
Oh, right. Absolutely. And there's still so many places that don't have any protections for anyone in the LGBTQIA plus population.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a real struggle. We also have the potential of the overturning of same-sex marriage and what that will do to families and to children and to even things like, health insurance for a married couple, that if that gets destroyed, then what will that, there's so many different aspects to this. And once that happens, if it does happen, and I'm concerned about that, then will the tide shift to where now those people who have already gained those rights and had them stripped away, so women, LGBTQIA, and so forth, and even interracial marriage, and then women having the right to even contraceptions, if that will be kind of a thing that galvanizes the other side in the same way that it did the religious right, and if we'll have any shift or not,
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, a key piece is looking at these. It's frustrating because these things happen on longer time horizons than you want. You want like an instant, everybody rising up in the street. It's you've got to have that kind of consistent organizing to get there, I think, and to get people, involved and motivated to do something. I think it's encouraging that we're seeing so much voter registration from young people, so much grassroots activism from young people. We need to keep that up and mobilize on that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else there. I mean, I think one thing too is that, this is not just affecting people in red states. It's going to affect people in blue states as well. As this is not something that the the Christian right is going to just focus on the states they control. They want to expand it everywhere. That, the bounty laws in Texas, which, I mean, I don't even quite know what to say about them, but it makes it very hard. It clearly was hard for them to kind of figure out a way to deal with that was their big legislative legislative achievement, that they could figure out a way to get around the undue burden that they're placing on people.
Right. Absolutely.
So look for that to come.
Well, we don't have a crystal ball, so we can't really tell.
Well, I always say historians are bad prognosticators, so I shouldn't be making predictions. We'll see.
But, the best way to predict is by looking at our past. And I think that's one thing that historians are able to look at, is see kind of there is a bit of a cyclical path that rights take and that progress makes. And it's usually always forward, but it kind of goes back and then it goes forward, then back and then forward. It kind of is this rolling thing. And so we can kind of see where we're headed. We're really on that backwards trend, and hopefully we can push ourselves forward. But things
We
are
have
so
to do it.
right. We just have to. Things are so different than they've ever been. I guess every generation feels that way, but it definitely feels like things are way different, and our backward shift is a much further backwards. At least that's how it feels.
I mean, I think what's interesting is I think history has never been a linear progress narrative. If we think about the era of Reconstruction, there was this moment of potential where we could have really had a true multiracial democracy, and we were seeing African Americans able to vote, to hold property, to contract for labor, to be represented in Congress. And then there was this enormous backlash,
right,
from Democrats in the South, from white supremacists.
Dixiecrats,
it went, and for decades, with the imposition of Jim Crow, you go backwards, and then through the work of activists, through the work of people pushing the law, and in the grassroots, and internationally, that's where you start to see change. So, we do have that wonderful saying, well, the arc of history bends towards justice, but it only bends that way if we do something. Like, it doesn't,
right.
It's not going to happen naturally, because you're going to have, as you said, that kind of push and pull. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a call to activism.
And it's also a call to remember that it's not the marginalized people who need to be doing this. If you look at the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s, it was white people who were kind of being the friend to the Black person, who were doing that work alongside of them. And once they got some rights, it could have been so much more. We could have continued in the 70s and the 80s, but a lot of those white people sat back and thought, okay, we've done what we need to do. We're done now.
Or they were like, back. Oh, it's all too, there's this like unfortunate problem of the moderate who does not want to see, they get uncomfortable with anger, with the changes requested. I mean, one of the issues that came up is that as the civil rights movement, as we start to see the rise of people like, of course, the Black Panthers, but also people like Martin Luther King Jr. calling for economic rights. So changes to the fundamental economic system in this country. So challenges to capitalism. Suddenly, you have, white moderates really backing away, and you see a backlash to that. And we start to and I get Reagan played up on this, right? That would be a whole different podcast. There's a lot to talk about that. But yeah, it needs to be a collective effort. Sort of everybody involved needs to be there in this, like, for the choice movement, where we need men to stand up too. It can't just be women active in the street. Like, everybody needs to do this together.
Right. It's people who have privilege helping those who are underprivileged. I think that's the big point I was trying to make. I want to thank you so much for coming on. I know we've gone a little bit over, but I wanted to kind of wrap that up. Do you have any final comments for us?
I think it's just that. It's to resist some of these changes, people need to be engaged in the ways that they are able to be. And everybody has a different capacity for the type of activism that they can do. But that's what I would say. And thank you for having me. It was fun to have this conversation.
Absolutely. I really, really enjoyed this. This hits all my boxes. This type of a discussion is extremely important to me, and I think to all of us right now. I want to thank our viewers. Remember to like, subscribe, share, hit the bell. And if you really like this type of content, think about joining our Patreon, and you get special perks, such as, if you wanted to, you can get a link and you could have come on and talk with Lauren yourself. You could have asked your questions, not just in the chat, but face-to-face, just like I'm doing. So think about that. I want to thank our current patrons, Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Bryce Cornell, Deborah Grace, Aaron Coalson, Phil Calderone, and me, Sunny Shell. I want to thank our producers, Wes, Phil, Pat, and Courageous. Our booking team, Wes, Raymond, and James. Don't forget our other shows. My show on Mondays, The Sunny Spot, Secular Soapbox, Global Atheist, and The Bible Says What. In the meantime, remember to always think critically. Good night, everybody.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. Everything I do so instinctive and so passionate. Every word I move so descriptive like an adjective. I got a vendetta against people who patented being negative when you should be getting after it. I got facts over tracks, this and that. Spitting slow, spitting fast. I could roast, I could gas. Think I'm okay at last, but I don't know if that can erase all the past. And the pettiness, a reflection of the emptiness. Hilarious, you think you're worth my time, you're delirious. Mysterious, because you are behind a fake exterior. Inferior, you know